Barcelona. And so I'm introducing Ana Pagès from Ramon Llull University in Barcelona. Ana has a most interesting background, having pursued research in relation to hermeneutics in education in particular, and then via various feminist lines of thought, she's become very interested in psychoanalysis, and also in, rather by contrast, I think, in John Dewey. So it's a very interesting mix of ideas. And we're delighted to have you, Ana, speak tonight on this topic, Jacques Lacan and the notion of teaching. Just before you begin, I will mention the fact that apart from, I think, 2 or 3 other books that are already published, Ana has one forthcoming, which will be published in Spanish and English in February this coming year, the title of which is There Remains the Voice, or There Remains a Voice, from Silence to Words. Queda una voz, There Remains the Voice. So Ana, over to you tonight then to speak on Jacques Lacan and the notion of teaching.
Thank you very much, Paul. I'm very grateful for you having invited me to be here today. Sometimes we, the people who live in academy, feel a kind of solitude from time to time. And so it's a very nice opportunity to share our thoughts and our readings with our colleagues from abroad and to exchange some of the impressions that we think are only our own, but in the end we realize that a dialogue is always something that can help to move on. Now, this is the title of my paper, Jacques Lacan and the Notion of Teaching. It is a simple title for a much more complex question. I have to clarify that I'm not a psychoanalyst and I'm not an expert on Jacques Lacan, but I've been reading Lacan for the last 20 years. And so I thought that I could pick up my readings on Lacan and try to have a look at philosophy of education at a distance. Trying to recover a lost word, which is the word teaching, in a world where learning process, evidence-based learning competencies are the words that we use in educational discourse, but perhaps we suffer of a certain amnesia of other key notions that we should analyze what's happening here. And I thought that Lacan, who was quite a weird personality, someone always on the outside of the establishment, could help us in this move. So the purpose of my paper then is to stress the relevance of Jacques Lacan in philosophy of education, or we could rather say to see philosophy of education from Lacan's point of view, but also shed new light on the notion of teaching in the context of what Gerd Biester had called learnification and Artilia a regime of learning, meaning this reduction of education to a learning or instructional process. Now, this is the principal facade of l'École Normale Supérieure in Paris, where Lacan gave his seminar, thanks to Louis Althusser, who received him for his oral teaching, and a high number of students gathered here from all the disciplines: anthropology, sociology, philosophy, psychiatry, medicine, linguistics, to listen to what Lacan was saying. Now, my idea here today would be to interpret or to give a new openness to my readings of Lacan through the works of 3 French contemporary philosophers On the left, you have Jean-Claude Milner, who was a close friend of Lacan, Alain Badiou, who was a student attending the seminar, and in the middle. And on the right, we have Jean-Pierre Clairaut, who is a philosopher, never knew Lacan, but he has just published a very interesting book on Lacan and the English language, and the la l'anglaise, as Lacan would put it. So, and the importance that Lacan gave to the English as a way of selecting words useful to say things that he could not say in French, even if French language was the place where he could move. Now, my paper has, as you will have seen, two parts. The first part includes a short biographical note of Lacan, and also a reference to Lacan's relationship with the English language. And in the second section, in this same part, I define some keywords for the people who is not familiar with psychoanalytic theory, namely the unconscious, the real, the transference, and the concept of la l'anglaise. Perhaps this introduction is a little long, but I think this is probably a requirement for better understanding of his theory. And so I will pass through this first part, and I will focus my presentation on the second part of my paper, where I try to formulate and develop the question of what is teaching and what can Lacan teaches us about teaching, or the experience of teaching that we have lost, and what could be his contribution to philosophy of education. Now, Lacan was born in 1901 in Paris and died in 1981 in Paris. He was the son of a middle-class Catholic family, studied medicine in 1932 with a thesis about paranoia through the case Aimée, a psychotic woman who tried to kill a famous actress at that time. This work earned him renown in the French psychiatric context. Now, Lacan was a figure through his career, marked by deep ruptures and permanent dissent. He raised the alarm about the routinization of psychoanalysis, reduced to what he called an ego psychology. The analyst in his time and in our time played the role of antagonist in his work. Although Lacan's work mainly addresses the analyst, it includes some suggesting ideas for philosophers, sociologists, and teachers. Now, being the position of a teacher outside the establishment, because as you have read in my paper, he was excommunicated by the International Psychoanalytical Association, he compared himself with Spinoza being expelled from the synagogue in the Kerem of Spinoza, would have many implications for him in the way he approached the problem of teaching from the outside. We will consider this particular issue in the following sections and when I speak about the what is teaching. Lacan was funny, unpredictable, and full of life. This is a picture of the conference he made in the University of Leuven in 1972. It's available in YouTube and with subtitled in English. His way of speaking, the tone of his voice, the spaces between words, his speaking style are only a few of many features that marked his very particular way of teaching orally. In the Louvain conference, a young man, a protester, interrupted the session, accusing Lacan of being a bourgeois and throwing a jar of milk on the top of his desk, shouting that he had the right to express himself. "Are you going to brutalize me?" the protester shouted. Lacan didn't react at all like the prototypical authoritarian teacher who wants to be in the control of the situation. On the contrary, he showed an extraordinary curiosity toward the protester and started a conversation with him, trying at the same time to calm him down in the kindest way possible. He said to him a very interesting sentence: You sit down and I will answer you. You will see how it all continues. So to see how it all continues would be a part of teaching as Lacan was offering to the participants in his seminar. Now, why read Lacan? In my paper, I explained that I came to Lacan because of my reading in French, and I was not the only one who was reading in French at that time. My colleagues in the Catalan universities were very fond of French philosophy, and we published our reflections on what the French language meant for us all, and we meet in order to talk about what happened with the French language and the French philosophy. For us, in general, taking a book in French, considering that a book of a philosophy written in French has a special way to approach the general philosophical question. There is a kind of abstraction in the way the language expresses philosophy. And so reading Lacan for me meant taking up a book and reading carefully without necessarily expecting to get it all. To read, as Lacan himself said, doesn't mean to understand. There is something else in reading that can be found beyond comprehension. Comprehension in hermeneutical terms is what Lacan has called an awful Weltanschauung, the dreadful cosmovision. What interests Lacan is not the idea of what the Germans call Die Welt, a complete self-comprehensive world, but what is lacking there. The object of psychoanalysis, says Lacan, is not the human being, but the thing he's lacking, not an absolute lack of something, but the lack of an object. Now, it is important to say that Lacan opened a debate on how to read Freud. The question of reading is very present in the way Lacan's work at his time. Lacan tried to read Freud from another perspective and tried to update his thought through the theory of structuralism at that time, Lévi-Strauss in anthropology, Jacobson in linguistics. And he introduced the notion of subject as an effect of a signifier. The most well-known sentence of Lacan says, the unconscious is structured like a language. So it is the place of the signifier, the word, within the chain of signifiers that produces the signified, the meaning. There is not an a prioristic correspondence between signifier and signified, which is a good news, a non-correspondence, as we will see later on. It depends on the place a signifier occupies within the signifier's chain, and it is the place that gives the signified its own effects of meaning. In my paper, I try to illustrate this idea and also the idea of what is a structure through the example given by Michel Foucault in the preface of The Order of Things, and then you can read it. Now, the French psychoanalyst Éric Laurent compares the unconscious from the perspective of Freud with Lacan's view using the images of two cities. For Freud, the unconscious was Rome, with all the ancient ruins and the effects of time, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, which together build the Roman archaeological landscape. It is a landscape of coexisting historical layers. Such is Freud's concept of the unconscious work. It maintains all the different levels, constantly interacting. But in the case of Lacan, the vision would rather be that of an American city, Baltimore, at sunrise, where everything works under the logic of productivity. The unconscious is a kind of automaton that works in its own way. On the other hand, we have the subject looking out from his hotel's window. So for Lacan, the unconscious is rather Baltimore at sunrise, where people goes to work and are productive while the subject is looking out through the window at a distance, trying to find a place out there. The static movement in the morning as a metaphor for the fact that we have been spoken by others previously. In education, this can be clearly perceived through the labels that parents and teachers, but also through the stories that parents and teachers give to children, projecting onto them their own expectations, fears, and desires. Now the question is, where am I in the middle of the discourse of the other? Now I'm going to suggest you to read the section in my paper where I try to explain what is the unconscious structured like a language, where everything are differences. What is the real, something that you can't symbolize in an elaborated way with a meaning. The real is when you get hit, in Lacan's word. Transference as a love or a demand of love projected to the analyst, that we can understand also in the setting, in teaching or school settings. And the question of la langue or la langlaise, which is a very interesting aspect to develop, that I have just made a short reference using Jean-Pierre Clairaut's last work, Lacan in the English language, published recently in 2021. So let's go to the key question in the paper, the crucial question in the paper: why Lacan in philosophy of education today? Is he not an author to be considered only by experts in psychoanalysis? I would like to defend here two arguments in favor of reading Lacan from the outside of psychoanalysis, from the outside of philosophy. The first argument, the first reason, has to do with the overall theoretical colonization of education by psychology today. Lacan refers to this colonization when he speaks about the psychologization of psychoanalysis. It is clear that a specific epistemological perspective based on evidence as a result of an imagined correspondence between the subject and the object of knowing has come to reign supreme over pedagogical discourse and practice. This psychological hegemony has, on the one hand, reduced the breadth of educational experience to a simple evidence-based fact or organic substract, neuroscientific substract, and on the other hand, has banished the experience of language to exile. Now, the second argument, the second reason, would be that studying what Lacan said about teaching and philosophy, even as an anti-philosopher in Alain's Badiou terms, can be a reference for the development of a philosophy of education that help us move beyond this reduction to terms associated with learning or the language of competencies, which is a problem today from my view. In his recent work, Arthelia has pointed out this problem very clearly. He underlines and worries about the oblivion of education in favor of learning, and he defends the existential dimension of education as a kind of road. I would say in Jean-Paul Sartre's view, he defends existence as something that precedes the whatever essence to be. On the other side, the technological approach to education has undermined its quality as an experience. What is an educational experience? An experience has to do with the impossibility of doing it all. If we follow the hypothesis that not everything can be planned or predicted in education, then we can stress the fact that education remains a human relational process where something unpredictable takes place. I believe that in our time, philosophy of education should get closer to this problem. Jean-Pierre Clairaut argues that philosophy can't really think without the contributions of psychoanalysis and vice versa. psychoanalysis is not thinkable nor practicable without philosophy. It is possible to state that in philosophy there is no working concept without language beyond the rigidity of academic forms of speaking and writing. In this sense, the work of Lacan is perfectly worthy of inspiring the philosophy of our time. Lacan also questions the direction of philosophy in academic settings. The main purpose of philosophy, to pose problems and make thinking possible, has been undermined by the invasion of ego psychology in academic discourse. Following Clairaut, perhaps psychoanalysis can be interrogated by Lacan so as to push the philosophers beyond themselves, asking uncomfortable questions such as, what have we done with the university? What kind of philosophers have we been? Or what kind of philosophers do we want to educate? What is teaching? I have highlighted 5 main points that can work as a research program when I think about them, and I have just made a short reference for each one of these 5 points, and let me go through them very shortly. Now, Lacan confronted a huge number of topics using the Socratic orientation, what is this? And following the path of this particular question, let us ask, what is teaching in a period when only learning seems to count? And let's go to the first point, Lacan's oral teaching, the protractics. Jean-Claude Milner refers to on the relationship between the seminar and the scripter. Lacan's teaching activity was of 2 kinds. On the one hand, the oral teaching. This is a picture of his conference in Llull. And we also have the scripta, what Jean-Claude Milner called the scripta, les écrits, where he establishes the concept developed in the seminars. Jean-Claude Milner states that Lacan's esoteric teaching is not the seminar, as has been generally considered, but the scripta, the écrit. Esoteric meaning from the inside, addressed to those who are inside. He also underlines the presence of something else in the exoteric teaching called protractics, which he defines as a discursive procedure whose function is to tear the subject away from doxa and towards theory. The role of protractics is to incite the subject to tear himself away from general opinion by chastising him. This technique is not new, and Milner says it has been used by the cynics, but also it is something we can find in Lewis Carroll, the surrealist, and, says Milner, also in Groucho Marx. Now, Milner insists on the importance of not idealizing the spoken word or the figure of the master. All idealization turns into nothing. He definitely rejects the idealizing constellation that is rooted in this practice, presence, the master, disciples, commemoration. The relevance of the seminar, despite Jean-Claude Milner's thesis that it is the scripta and not the seminar, which can be considered as esoteric, reveals a complete web of protractics, allusions, literary or scholarly flourishes, diatribes, deconstructions of doxa. So we could oppose the notion of protractics to those of doctrine in the sense of an openness of thought confronted to a closed one. Teaching has then to do with a protractic movement. Milner also highlights that Lacan's oral teaching is intended to grab hold of the listener, seeking to dislodge him from his natural location by a violent movement, which in Lacan, in contrast to Plato, takes on the form of diatribe, if not inventive, monological, and sometimes unpolite dialogues. In his analysis of Lacan's works, Jean-Claude Milner points out an interesting aspect of teaching, the relation between the spoken and the written word. Nowadays, we tend to associate teaching with what happens in a classroom or a lecture hall, living outside, writing in the form of a published paper or a book as a result of a university professor's research. Perhaps we could articulate better the spoken and the written sides of teaching in the same movement, focusing on its protractic side. As Milner says regarding Lacan's oeuvre, everything in the scripta is relevant for the interpretation of the oral teaching. In today's teaching experience, the tie between the spoken and the written must be strengthened, elevating the protective side of teaching and relegating the doctrinal dimension to a secondary role. We must do so in order to regain a certain lost balance between what is to be suggested and what is to be known by students through the teaching experience. Teaching as an experience. Jean-Pierre Clairaut states that Lacan uses very much the word experience, but he does not develop this concept explicitly. In Clairaut's view, it is possible to discuss this notion in the context of Kant. From Lacan's perspective, the experience does not refer to a series of objects as a product of theory, nor does it refer to what we call today an inner experience, because in Lacan's view, this has a high probability of being fake or fictitious. What is then the setting for the notion of experience in Lacan? As Clairaut says, Lacan admits a certain type of experience which is not a kind of ultimate sense to be uncovered, nor, as Max Scheler would put it, the discovery of values as an essence. Far from it, Lacan questions the illusionary distinction between the interior and the exterior, an intimate sense and an external sense of any experience. He also questions, and this is a key point in my development, he questions the correspondence between subject and object of knowledge through an imaginary perfect match between the two. Linguistic constructions are in themselves the experience. Hence, there is no experience to be validated in an empiricist orientation or through the coincidence between subject and object, or learning objectives and learning outcomes. An experience is the single or unique case. In other words, we could say that experience appears as such when there is an exception. Clairaut defends that, for Lacan, it is possible to give value to the experience by validating it in a different way that Kant's idea of transcendence. In the case of Lacan, there is no meta-language to refer to an experience. If we translate to philosophy the idea that experience means that the theoretical norm in his abstract dimension can be contravened, the Lacanian use of experience through the particular case can be very useful to the philosophical tendency to use an infinity of notions without limitations, the beauty, the justice, the truth, the good. Experience acts as a filter to the abstraction of the general law. It excludes any a prioristic concept, rendering it to its basic contingency. And in Lacan's terms, the ultimate contingency is the signifier. In the field of education, teaching would then be a place of contingency, where the case, the exceptional situation, can be defined as whatever is not working well. There are many elements in the present regime of learning, using René Sartilia's expression, which function as a kind of general law, curriculum, competencies, learning-based evidence, evaluation, levels of acquisition. But none of these can explain what teaching is as an experience. It is the singularity of the case that makes an experience into something in between what the student says or does, and what is being said or done in a specific moment in the classroom. Thus, teaching as an experience stands in opposition to the general a prioristic propositions of education, making it lay down on the couch of the case by case, the singularity of what is not understood or controlled at first sight. In this direction, we could affirm there would be no correspondence whatsoever between instructional goals and learning outcomes. Only the case can bear witness to the everyday teaching experience. The difference between instruction and transmission. Now, the idea of transmission as opposed to instruction occurs in what Jean-Claude Milner calls the logia as something well said. He uses the French expression well dire. This idea of the logia is a concept used for the analysis of the Gospels and has to do with an important distinction between instruction and transmission. Instruction is considered a process of planning, executing, and assessing learning, and its final purpose is to pass something onto the student. On the other hand, transmission of knowledge refers to what can reach the student beyond what has been planned, executed, or assessed. It is the result of a certain transmission and its effects of surprise. Sometimes it is not passing to the student in the same direction as instruction, and it is, of course, unconscious. Why are we not speaking of hidden curriculum at this point? The idea of something hidden would mean there is something actually there, not a place, but a kind of essence. Lacan would definitely refute such a contention. There is no such hidden essence, but rather an unstable functioning. The unconscious would then be, in terms of Lacan, what is blocking the effectiveness of a process. Something is missing, but we can't say where. It is not a question of an essence, but that of a work of structure. Only if the teacher speaks in an unstable, elusive, wandering, and digressive way can something of the kind happen. A teacher under this condition needs to speak and to write with a certain desire for language. A subject teacher would then be required. Teaching as an act. Lacan poses the problem of the relationship between truth and knowledge in what he calls teaching. In one of his main writings, Allocution on Teaching, he approaches this problem in terms of what Alain Badiou has called an anti-philosophy. Truth may not convince, knowledge acts. This is the sentence of Lacan. In his seminar of 94-95, Alain Badiou addressed the question of anti-philosophy regarding Lacan. He states that the problem of truth related to knowledge in the case of Lacan is somewhat equivalent to the question of truth related to sense in the case of Wittgenstein. The anti-philosophers don't eradicate the philosophical category of truth, but they question it. Besides Badiou, from the late 70s, Lacan initiates a movement of separation between truth and knowledge in favor of the latter. I cannot develop this particular point here, but it's important to say that for Lacan, there would be a knowledge about truth at stake in teaching. Now, Lacan describes the more traditional teaching as a master's discourse and knowledge in an antagonistic relation. When the teacher assumes his role as master, a certain truth represents him, or on the other way around, he represents and produces a certain kind of truth. But truth can be questioned through the raising of knowledge. In this same text, Lacan says, I quote, "What is saving me from teaching is the act, and what is bearing witness of the act is that I will never had a tomorrow for my shelter, or a shelter for something that, remaining deaf to what I bring, offers the luxury of spreading out that he ignores his lack to subsist." What Lacan points out here is the fact that the university discourse does not perceive itself as lacking something. It is presented as a whole doctrinal corpus of contents, and therefore the professor occupies the place of the master. Something similar happens with certain approaches in the instructional dimension of competencies at school. But knowledge would be here nothing else than a structure organized by the position of the signifier master that makes its own truth. Now, the position of the teacher in the sense of developing a knowledge on truth should not be that of the master. Teaching means revealing something the teacher does not know about what he or she is saying. The teacher, says Lacan, is located where there is a subject barred. This means that teaching is something that occurs when there is a lack. This is what moves the teacher from the place of truth towards knowledge. Says Lacan, teaching could be made to build a fence to knowledge. From there gushes the little evidence, let us say, of the relation knowledge-teaching. This sentence means that sometimes teaching requires the student not to think or not to ask questions that can mobilize what has been previously said. But if, on the contrary, we try to open up the knowledge-teaching relationship, we can give teachers the opportunity to act as subjects beyond the technical jargon they use or within which they are being used. What is the relation of a teacher with what she is teaching and with the students through the teaching itself? This question can be addressed if we think in terms of teaching beyond a mere possession of knowledge, but rather as a fragile point of leakage from where the teacher can be affected. Teachers are affected, moved by what they teach, even if they are completely unaware of this. They are also affected by the school system and its bureaucratic functioning. Being affected allows them to discover what happens to the knowledge they thought was owned as a truth. This is the point where the truth shifts and opens up the possibility of an alternative relation to knowledge. It is important here to understand knowledge not as an instructional content, but as the missing point in a teaching discourse. In other words, it is knowledge that is yet to be known. Why am I not stressing here the fact that knowledge should be stable and consistent if it is to be taught? Lacan does not share this view. He states that when knowledge is included in teaching, it is unfortunately often precisely due to its capacity to generate a master's discourse. In other words, to produce its own truth. Learning by doing as a motto can be an example of this reigning signifier in education. It functions as a mandate, an organizing principle of the educational discourse. Nevertheless, this is not the only way to view teaching, which can also be seen as a way out towards knowledge, shifting away from producing its own truth. Under this view, we can affirm that teaching has an unstable side, resisting a complete and omnipresent mastery of the action. Now, what is the difference between an action and an act? In the action, there is intentionality, whereas in the act, something merely takes place, or it's not necessarily done with a purpose. When you act, it is always too late, while when you take action, you can regulate the action and what you're doing inside the action. If we translate these ideas to teaching, we could say there is in teaching a dimension of the real. There is a kind of symbolic void that the teacher has to face regarding the students, regarding his or her subjectivity, and regarding the subject being taught. These are the consequences of considering teaching as more than a simple fact of instruction in the form of a master's discourse. Genuine teaching is always an act, too late to reformulate or to understand. The teacher is there on the edge of his or her own speech, and he or she gets caught up in the moment of the act. The action of teaching, though, involves many other aspects that can enter into dialogue with a purpose. It is possible then to think of regulating an action as a process. We can say that today the pedagogical discourse in the regime of learning has excluded the notion of act in teaching while reinforcing at the same time the approach focused on action. Teaching and transference. Now, transference is a movement that makes for the subject function what we call a subject supposed to know, sujet supposé savoir, subject supposed to know. And Lacan says that whenever this function, transference, may be for the subject embodied in some individual, whether or not an analyst, the transference, according to the definition he gives of transference, is established. Now, from Lacan's view, teaching cannot take place without transference. In other words, without what the students project or imagine about a setting that is not completely there, but that has to do with a demand of love that the student makes to the teacher, placing the teacher as a subject supposed to know. Like Alcibiades asking Socrates to answer their own demand of love. This is something that Nietzsche also pointed out in a wonderful essay on the future of our educational institutions in 1872, when he made the distinction between teaching philosophy and doing philosophy. In doing philosophy, there has to be some supposition of a subject to know, whereas teaching philosophy would imply to the philosopher of the hammer something dull and merely instructive. But in the idea of teaching as an effect of transference, the teacher has to know there is this demand of love on the side of the student, and he is committed to react in a way without answering all the questions the student makes in a kind of Socratic position. Now, would it be possible to make a Lacanian research program in philosophy of education? I guess that in my paper, I opened up many questions to be explored, each one in its own depth. I have only made a short introduction on Lacan's piece of work. Could we do field research in philosophy of education? Go to the university teaching, go to the school teaching, and have a look at it from the position of what Lacan called the inconsistency of a discourse which does not want to produce truth, but to open up to knowledge. I believe there is a lack of vitality in the present and standardized approach to teaching under the overwhelming dominance of learning as a process that supposedly can be achieved and overall be successful. Success is a command for us all today. Rousseau in the Emile warned educators on the dangers of believing that educational experience could be controlled. And as he said in book first, if education is an art, then succeeding becomes almost impossible. Perhaps reading Lacan can be a compass to guide us along this new way of seeing philosophy of education, allowing us to analyze classrooms with an alternative view, looking for what is lacking there, but not to match it or to adjust it to something or to a previous idea of what we wanted to do, but standing there in the imperfect match between teachers, students, and content, which is supposed to be taught without being taught. And I think it's a little late. Okay, so perhaps we could leave it here and start a little discussion. I'm sorry if I spoke too fast.
Thank you very much, Anna. That was extremely clear, and you didn't speak too fast at all. It's very
Okay, thank you, Paul.
good to listen and follow. So as